Is this really the best we have? Victoria Hale's voice cut clean through the glass-walled boardroom, sharp enough to stop fingers mid-typing and eyes mid-blink. And for a second, even the low hum of the city outside seemed to hesitate as if it, too, had heard the judgment. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to, because power rarely shouts when it knows it owns the room. And across the long polished table, Ethan Cole stood still with a tablet in his hand, his shirt sleeves slightly rolled, his tie loosened just enough to suggest a man who worked more than he spoke, but not enough to earn respect in a room like this. A few people exchanged glances. One smirked, another leaned back in their chair, waiting for the moment to land, and Victoria took a slow step forward, heels clicking once, twice, controlled, deliberate, as she glanced at the numbers projected on the screen behind him. "You're telling me this is your solution?" she asked, her tone calm, but edged with something colder than frustration, something closer to dismissal. Ethan didn't rush to answer, didn't flip through slides, didn't defend himself with words stacked too fast to hold weight. He simply looked at the data once more as if confirming something only he could see, then said quietly, "It's a starting point." And that was enough. Enough to tilt the room into soft laughter, the kind that tried to stay polite but failed, the kind that echoed just long enough to make its meaning clear. Victoria exhaled through a faint smile that never reached her eyes, turning slightly toward the rest of the team as if inviting them to witness the gap between expectation and reality. "A starting point," she repeated, slower this time, as if testing how little the phrase could carry. "We're not here for starting points, Mr. Cole. We're here for results." And there it was, the line that settled like a final stamp. A quiet verdict delivered in front of people who would remember exactly where they were when it was said, someone near the end of. The table whispered something under their breath. Another tapped a pen twice against a notebook, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, not shrinking, not pushing back, just present in a way that didn't ask for permission. The screen behind him flickered faintly as the system cycled through projections, numbers rising and falling in patterns no one in the room seemed ready to fully understand. And for a brief moment, the fluorescent lights above cast a soft reflection across the table, turning every face into something sharper, more defined, more exposed. Victoria crossed her arms, waiting, expecting a correction, a defense, something louder, something that matched the stakes of the room. But Ethan only nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and lowered the tablet slightly, as if the conversation had already moved on without needing to say so. The laughter faded, replaced by a thin layer of silence that didn't quite settle, not yet, not fully, like a room deciding whether it had just witnessed the end of something or the beginning of something it couldn't quite name. And no one there, not the analysts, not the executives, not even Victoria Hale herself, realized that the quiet man they had just dismissed had already seen the flaw that would bring everything in that room to a halt. The room did not move on as quickly as Victoria expected, not because anyone challenged her, but because something in the air had shifted just slightly, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but lingers in the space between breaths. She turned back to the screen, tapping once on her tablet as the next set of projections appeared, clean graphs, confident lines, the kind of visuals that usually restored order. And yet her eyes flicked once more toward Ethan, as if confirming that he had stepped back into the background where she believed he belonged. "We do not have time for uncertainty," she continued, her voice regaining its measured authority. "This deal closes in 72 hours, and every variable needs to be controlled." Three executives nodded almost in unison. One leaned forward and added quickly, "We can reallocate resources, tighten the model, maybe push the margin by 2%. Another chimed in, "Or restructure the rollout timeline, delay the risk exposure." The exchange came fast, efficient, polished, the rhythm of people trained to sound certain even when they were not. And for a moment it worked. The room began to rebuild its confidence on familiar ground. Then Ethan spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just present. "If you delay the rollout, you trigger the penalty clause." His voice landed without force, but it interrupted the rhythm just enough to be noticed. A pause followed, brief but real, and one of the analysts frowned slightly, scrolling through their own data, as if checking something they had overlooked. Victoria did not turn fully this time. Only her eyes shifted, cool, assessing. "We have already accounted for contractual flexibility," she replied, each word precise, controlled. "That clause will not activate under revised conditions." Ethan nodded once, the same quiet acknowledgement, and then added, "It activates if the supplier index drops below 43. Another pause, longer now. The kind that stretches just enough for doubt to slip in unnoticed. The analyst who had been scrolling stopped, their fingers hovering above the keyboard, and slowly, almost reluctantly, they looked up. "The index is at 45, they said, trying to sound certain. "It has not dropped below threshold." Ethan did not argue, did not push, he only said, "It will." 2 words, simple, unembellished, and yet they did something the earlier confidence could not undo. The lights above buzzed softly. The screen behind him refreshed again, and somewhere near the window a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight, unsure whether to dismiss the comment or consider it. Victoria straightened slightly, the smallest change in posture, but enough to signal that she was listening more carefully now, even if she would not admit it. "And what exactly are you basing that on?" she asked, not dismissive this time, but sharper, more focused. Ethan glanced at the data once more, then at her, not challenging, not defensive, simply steady. "A pattern you are not tracking," he said, and the room did not laugh this time. No one leaned back, no one whispered, because something in the way he said it did not invite reaction, it invited attention. Victoria held his gaze for a second longer than before, then turned back to the screen. But her expression had changed, not visibly to everyone, but enough that the silence beneath the conversation had deepened, like the first quiet sign that control was no longer absolute. The silence did not break cleanly, it thinned, stretched, and then fractured under the weight of uncertainty as the analyst's fingers finally resumed moving, slower this time, less confident, pulling up secondary data streams that had not been part of the original presentation, and one by one, small details began to surface, minor fluctuations, overlooked variables, patterns that had been dismissed as noise because they did not fit the model everyone trusted. Victoria watched the screen without speaking, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now, tracing the movement of numbers that no longer behaved as expected. "Pull the supplier index history for the past 90 days, she said, her voice steady but lower, and the command carried across the room with quiet urgency. Another analyst responded immediately. On it, while someone near the far end added, "We already reviewed the trend lines." Though their voice lacked the certainty it had just minutes ago, the graph appeared, clean at first glance, rising and falling within acceptable limits. But then Ethan stepped forward half a pace, not enough to claim the space, just enough to see more clearly, and he pointed, not dramatically, just a small motion toward a cluster of data points. "There," he said, and the room leaned in, not physically all at once, but mentally, attention narrowing toward the exact place he indicated. "That dip repeats every 12 days, he continued, his tone unchanged, and each time it recovers slightly weaker." The analyst zoomed in, isolating the pattern, and for a second, no one spoke because they could see it now, the rhythm hidden beneath the surface, subtle but consistent, like a quiet signal that had been ignored until it became impossible to miss. "It is within tolerance," someone insisted, almost reflexively, but Ethan did not argue. He only added, "Until it is not." And the words landed differently this time, not as speculation, but as a projection that felt uncomfortably close. Victoria's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign that something inside her calculation had shifted. "What happens if it drops below 43? She asked, not to dismiss him, but to test the implication directly, and the analyst who had been scrolling earlier hesitated before answering. "The penalty clause activates." A beat passed, then another, and the room seemed to draw in a collective breath it did not release. "How long before that happens?" Victoria asked, her eyes still on the screen, and this time the analyst did not answer immediately. They ran the numbers again, adjusted the model, accounted for the pattern Ethan had pointed out, and when they finally spoke, their voice was quieter. 48 hours, maybe less if the decline accelerates." The words settled into the room like a weight, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. No one laughed now. No one shifted casually in their seat. The earlier confidence had dissolved into something more fragile, more real, and Victoria slowly turned her head toward Ethan, studying him not as an inconvenience, not as a subordinate, but as a variable she had not fully measured. "You saw this before," she said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, and Ethan met her gaze with the same calm he had held from the beginning. "Yes," he replied, and for the first time since the meeting began. The room was not waiting for Victoria to speak, it was waiting for him. Victoria did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything she had said earlier, because it marked the exact moment control began to shift from certainty to calculation. She turned fully toward Ethan now, no longer dividing her attention between him and the screen, and the room followed her movement without realizing it. Every pair of eyes settling on the quiet man who had not raised his voice once, yet had managed to redirect the entire conversation. "Explain the pattern," she said, direct, stripped of tone, and for the first time it was not a command meant to assert authority, it was a request for clarity. Ethan stepped forward another inch, not claiming space, just occupying it with intention, his gaze moving briefly to the data before returning to her. "It is not random fluctuation," he said. "It is a supply compression cycle triggered by regional demand spikes that are being reported 12 hours late." 3 sentences, measured, precise, and then he paused, letting the words settle instead of rushing to fill the silence. The analysts exchanged quick looks, one of them already typing faster now, pulling external data feeds, referencing timestamps, and another leaned in closer to the screen as if proximity could confirm what logic had just begun to suggest. "That is not in our current model," someone said, quieter than before, and Ethan nodded once. "Because your model assumes real-time reporting," he replied. "But the suppliers are batching their data to stabilize pricing perception." The explanation landed like a key turning in a lock, subtle, almost quiet, but irreversible once heard. Victoria's expression did not change dramatically, but the sharp edge of dismissal had softened into something more focused, more deliberate. "If that is true," she said, her voice steady, "then the index is not just declining. It is being delayed." Ethan met her eyes and answered simply, "Yes," and the room absorbed that single word as if it carried more than its weight. A few seconds passed where no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been revealed. In the data now reshaping itself on the screen, one of the senior executives cleared his throat lightly. "We can adjust for delayed reporting," he offered, attempting to regain footing, but his voice lacked the earlier confidence, and another added, "We would need to rebuild the forecast entirely," while a third simply leaned back, arms crossed, watching Ethan with a new kind of attention that was not rooted in hierarchy but in recognition. Victoria took a slow breath, then another, her posture still upright, still composed, but the certainty that had defined her presence at the start of the meeting was now being replaced by something more careful, more precise. "What is the correction?" she asked, and this time there was no hint of challenge in her voice, only the expectation of an answer. Ethan did not look at the room, did not seek approval. He simply turned slightly toward the screen and pointed again, the same minimal gesture. "You do not correct the model," he said, and the room leaned in again, drawn by the calm certainty of someone who did not need to convince. "You correct the assumption." 2 sentences, then a pause, and in that pause, something deeper shifted because, for the first time since the meeting began, no one was questioning whether he was right. They were waiting to understand how right he was. No one spoke for nearly 3 full seconds, and in a room that usually measured time in rapid exchanges and overlapping voices, that silence felt longer than it should have, heavier than it had any right to be. Victoria's eyes followed Ethan's hand as he indicated the data again, her focus narrowing not just on the numbers, but on the logic beneath them. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a different weight, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate. "Then correct it," she said, and this time it was not a directive thrown into the room for someone else to solve. It was aimed directly at him. 3 analysts glanced at each other. One opened their mouth as if to respond, then stopped, unsure whether to step in or step back, and Ethan did not rush. did not fill the space with unnecessary explanation. He simply stepped closer to the screen and reached for the control panel, pausing just long enough to ensure no one objected, and when no one did, he adjusted the model with a few precise inputs, removing the real-time assumption, recalibrating the data intervals, and introducing a delay factor that none of them had considered before. The screen shifted, the clean upward projections flattening, then dipping, not dramatically at first, but enough to signal that the earlier confidence had been built on incomplete information. "Run the forecast," Victoria said, her tone steady, and the analyst nearest the system complied immediately, pressing the command with a subtle hesitation that betrayed their awareness of what might appear next. The simulation processed, numbers recalculating, graphs redrawing themselves in real time, and then the result appeared, clear, undeniable. The supplier index falling below 43 within 46 hours, just as Ethan had suggested. A quiet exhale moved through the room, not synchronized, but shared, the sound of people realizing that the margin for error had been far thinner than they had believed. One executive leaned forward, elbows on the table now, no longer relaxed. "If that happens, we lose the deal," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that no longer needed confirmation. Another added quickly, "We would also trigger secondary penalties across the network," their voice tighter, more urgent, and a third simply shook their head once, as if recalculating everything they thought they understood. Victoria did not look away from the screen immediately. She let the projection remain in front of her for a moment longer, absorbing it fully before turning back to Ethan. And when she did, the shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, the earlier dismissal gone, replaced by something closer to recognition. "What is the solution?" she asked, and the room went still again. But this time it was not uncertainty that held them. It was expectation. Ethan did not answer right away. He studied the data for one more second, as if confirming that nothing had been missed. Then he spoke, calm as before. "You do not fight the drop," he said, and a few brows furrowed instinctively, conditioned to respond to problems with resistance. "You move ahead of it," he continued, and now the room leaned in again, drawn not by authority, but by clarity. He adjusted one more variable, shifting the timeline forward by 36 hours, redistributing the supply load before the compression cycle peaked. And as the model recalculated once more, the projection changed again. The dip still present, but no longer crossing the critical threshold, no longer triggering the penalty clause. No one interrupted, no one questioned the logic in that moment, because the numbers were already speaking, and for the first time since the meeting began, the silence in the room was not uncertainty or doubt, it was understanding. The projection stabilized on the screen, and with it came a quiet that felt different from the ones before, not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded, as if the room had finally aligned with something real. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to reclaim the narrative, because the data had already settled the argument in a way that did not require reinforcement. Victoria stood still for a moment longer, her eyes tracing the adjusted model, the new timeline, the corrected assumptions, and when she finally moved, it was slower, more deliberate, as if every step now carried the weight of recalibration. "Walk me through the execution," she said, turning fully toward Ethan, and this time there was no distance in her tone, no layer of dismissal, only focus. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the shift without commenting on it, and stepped closer to the table, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he outlined the sequence. "We advance procurement by 36 hours, he began. "Reallocate inventory across 3 regions, and absorb the early demand spike before the compression cycle completes." 3 sentences, clear, structured, and then he paused, letting the room process before continuing. One of the executives leaned forward. "That will strain logistics," he said, testing the plan, and Ethan met his concern without resistance. "Only if you maintain current routing," he replied. "But if you shift to the secondary distribution network, you reduce transit time by 14%. The analyst nearest the logistics model began typing again, verifying the numbers, and within seconds, a quiet confirmation followed. "He is right," they said, not loudly, but enough for everyone to hear. Victoria watched the exchange without interrupting, her attention fixed not just on the solution, but on the consistency behind it. The way each answer connected to the last without contradiction or hesitation. And the cost? She asked, her voice steady, testing the final variable, and Ethan answered just as simply. Higher in the short term, he said, but it prevents a loss that is significantly greater. Another pause, another moment, where the room adjusted its expectations, and this time no one challenged the logic, because it had already proven itself. A senior manager cleared his throat. We would need approval to reroute at that scale, he said, and for a brief second, the room turned back to Victoria, instinctively, waiting for her decision, the hierarchy reasserting itself in form if not in certainty. Victoria held their gaze for a moment, then looked back at Ethan, and something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement, not yet, but recognition of competence that could no longer be ignored. You will oversee the adjustment, she said, the words directed at him, precise, final, and a subtle ripple moved through the room, not of resistance, but of recalibration, as roles shifted without announcement. Ethan did not react with surprise or pride. He simply nodded once, accepting the responsibility as if it had always been part of the plan, and turned back to the screen, already moving to implement the next step. The analysts followed his lead now without hesitation. Inputs aligning, systems updating, and for the first time since the meeting began, the momentum in the room no longer came from authority alone. It came from clarity. Victoria remained where she was, watching not just the execution, but the man she had dismissed less than an hour ago, and though she said nothing more, the silence that settled around her carried a different meaning now, not the silence of control, but the silence of someone who had just realized she had underestimated the only person in the room who had been quietly right from the beginning. The room moved with a new rhythm now, quieter, sharper, every keystroke more intentional as the revised plan unfolded across screens and systems. And yet beneath that motion, something else began to surface, something that had nothing to do with logistics or data. One of the senior analysts paused mid-input, his eyes narrowing at a name that had just appeared in a legacy reference field, something buried deep in the system architecture, something no one had touched in years, and he leaned closer, scrolling back, then forward again, as if confirming that what he was seeing was not a mistake. Wait, he said, not loudly, but enough to break the flow, and a few heads turned, including Victoria's, her attention shifting immediately to the disruption. The analyst hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke again. This framework, he said, pointing to the underlying model now being adjusted. It is built on an older architecture. I have seen this before. Ethan did not react, did not look up. He continued entering commands with the same steady pace. But the analyst kept going, his voice gaining a quiet urgency. This is the Cole adaptive model, he said, and that name, simple as it sounded, carried a weight that did not belong to the present moment. Another analyst froze, fingers hovering above the keyboard. That model was decommissioned years ago, she said, confusion threading through her tone. It was developed by a lead strategist who left the industry. A pause followed, then she added, almost cautiously, Ethan Cole, and the room shifted again, not physically, but perceptibly, like a current running beneath the surface that everyone suddenly felt at once. Victoria's gaze moved slowly from the screen to the man standing just a few feet away, her expression no longer guarded, no longer dismissive, but searching, recalculating, and for the first time, uncertain in a way she had not been before. That is, your name, she said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating the connection that had just become impossible to ignore. And Ethan finally stopped, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the console as he turned to face her fully. 3 seconds passed. No one spoke, the air holding its shape as if waiting for something to settle into place. And then he nodded once. Yes, he said, calm, unembellished. And that single word carried more impact than any explanation could have. The analyst, who had first spoken, leaned back slightly, exhaling as if a long-held assumption had just been confirmed. You designed this entire predictive system, he said, not as praise, but as recognition, and Ethan did not correct him, did not expand. He simply replied, I did. 2 words, measured, and then silence returned, deeper this time. Heavier, because it was no longer built on uncertainty or confusion. It was built on realization. Victoria's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders easing not in weakness, but in the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. "You left," she said, her voice softer now, more deliberate. "Why?" And for a moment, it seemed like the question extended beyond the room, beyond the company, into something more personal, more human. Ethan glanced briefly at the screen, where the corrected model continued to stabilize, then back at her, his expression steady, unreadable. "Because I did not need to prove anything anymore," he said, and the room absorbed those words in silence. Because for the first time, it was not just his intelligence that defined him, it was the quiet certainty behind it, the kind that did not ask for recognition, did not demand respect, but somehow, in that moment, commanded both without trying. No one moved to fill the silence after his answer, and that absence of reaction spoke louder than anything that could have followed, because it forced everyone in the room to confront the gap between who they thought he was and who he had just revealed himself to be. Victoria did not look away, her eyes steady on Ethan as if recalibrating not just her understanding of him, but of the entire moment that had led here. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was no trace of performance in her posture, no need to assert control, only the quiet discipline of someone choosing her next words carefully. "You built the system we are still using," she said, slower now, each word measured. "And you chose to stand in this room without saying a single thing about it." 3 statements, not questions, and then a pause. And in that pause the weight of what she had done earlier settled in fully, not as embarrassment, but as clarity. Ethan did not respond immediately, he simply held her gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just present. And then he said, "The work matters more than the name." A simple sentence, but it carried the kind of conviction that could not be performed, only lived. A few people shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, because the tone of the room had changed again, this time in a way that reached beyond data and strategy into something quieter, something more human. One of the executives who had spoken earlier lowered his eyes to the table, as if replaying his own words from the start of the meeting, and another leaned back, exhaling slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that suggested not relief, but humility. Victoria's expression softened, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that she understood the difference between authority and respect. "I misjudged you," she said, not loudly, not formally, but clearly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any extended apology could have, because it was not offered to repair her image, it was offered to acknowledge the truth. Ethan nodded once, accepting the statement without expanding it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be, and in that quiet exchange, the balance of the room shifted once more, not toward him as a figure of power, but toward him as a point of certainty. Victoria took a small step forward, closing the distance that had defined their interaction earlier, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to stand without speaking, as if recognizing that not every moment required control, some required understanding. Then she turned slightly, addressing the room again. But her voice carried a different tone now, grounded, precise. "We proceed with the revised plan," she said, and there was no hesitation in the response this time, no need for validation, because the decision had already been shaped by something stronger than authority alone. The analysts moved quickly, executing with clarity, and the earlier tension that had filled the space was replaced by a quieter, more focused energy, one built on alignment rather than assumption. Victoria looked back at Ethan one last time, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement, and though she said nothing more, the silence between them no longer carried judgment. It carried respect, the kind that does not need to be declared because it has already been understood. The meeting did not end with applause or raised voices. It ended the way truth often does, quietly, with people returning to their roles carrying a different understanding than the one they walked in with. Screens continued to update, numbers aligned with the revised model, and the earlier tension that had once filled the room had dissolved into a focused calm, the kind that does not demand attention because it is rooted in clarity. Ethan stepped back from the console once the final adjustments were in place. his hands resting briefly at his sides as he observed the system stabilize, not seeking recognition, not waiting for acknowledgement, just ensuring that what needed to be done had been done. Across the table, Victoria remained still for a moment longer, her gaze moving from the data to the people, and finally back to him, as if marking the shift not just in the outcome, but in the way she would remember this moment. One of the executives spoke quietly. "The numbers are holding," and another added, "We are clear of the penalty threshold." Their voices steady now, grounded in confirmation rather than assumption, and no one felt the need to question it further because the evidence was already present. A few chairs shifted, notebooks closed, and the low hum of conversation began to return, but it was softer, more measured, as if everyone had learned something that could not be easily put into words. Victoria took a step forward, not toward the center of the room, but toward Ethan, and, for a brief second, the movement drew attention without demanding it, a subtle acknowledgement that the distance between them earlier had been more than physical. She stopped just within a respectful space, her posture composed, but no longer guarded.